to France to see what he was doing. When I got there, the fucking place was ruined. No, I haven't seen old Hitler for a hell of a time. He must have been buggered by a mine. But if he's the leader of the Deutschland Reader, fucking he's no cousin of mine.
Hello, I'm John Coleman from ApocatastasisInstitute for the Humanities and Alternative College and High School here on New Milford, Connecticut, USA. The purpose of this broadcast is to review Sir Winston Churchill's sixth and final volume of his Second World War series, Triumph and Tragedy. This was originally published in 1953, nearly a decade after the war, and deals with everything from D-Day inclusive to the Potsdam Conference. Before we hove into our text, a long time in coming, nearly 6 months to read through these volumes, one announcement. The broadcast you are enjoying now is indeed part of the work of ApocatastasisInstitute, a college here in Connecticut. And if you are inspired to delve into literature and history, including the Second World War, I encourage you to check out our enrollment and matriculation page and to review our various courses here. The top shelf offering of which is The Project, a 3-year study of human history on this earth in an integrated fashion from the time of the cavemen to today. This is meant to be a substitute for full-time high school work or undergraduate work. The commitment for this requires that amount of time, reading, preparation, and so forth, except you're going to get a far more integrated and a higher quality product than you will get in any school. And part of that is not because of the genius of myself and our other staff here. Part of that is simply by coordinating the subjects that we teach over those 3 years, you will have a much more symphonic understanding of human life on this earth than you will get literally in any other school whose curricula is deliberately shattered. Modern education, public, private, or home, grade, or tertiary, will destroy your ability to perceive reality in a unified whole. Come to Apocatastasis and you don't have to worry about that. And you can study World War II. All right. So here is our text. Rather, here is my text. I like the old physical books from the library. The New Milford Library is pretty useless for various reasons, but it still has a few books. It lost most of its books when it so-called renovated, and they have plenty of directions to download digital text, but there's still a few physical pulp paper cardboard books around, and one of those collections are the 6 volumes, of which today's subject is indeed the final one, Triumph and Tragedy. The triumph, obviously, as far as the author is concerned, is the victory of the Allies over, in particular, for his concern, the Germans. There is some attention paid in this work to events in the Far East, including with this pervert, Lord Mountbatten, whom the IRA, thank God, blew sky high eventually. as the slogan went in Belfast, referencing Bloody Sunday, 13 gone and not forgotten, we got 18, and Lord Mountbatten, this bastard, in an earlier part of his life was in charge of the Burmese theater, and Churchill does address that. If you think Prince Andrew's dialects presently are wicked, you have no idea about Lord Mountbatten. Entire rooms of Buckingham Palace were given over to his files of his various dialects. And enough about that. In any case, most of this triumph and tragedy concerns the events in Western Europe. The tragedy, of course, refers, from Churchill's point of view, to the unfinished business regarding the Soviet Union and indeed the tremendous advances that empire made in the ruins and the chaos at the end of the war, and as Churchill would see it, a certain lack of nerve on the part of the Americans, the British, and the French. So triumph and tragedy. My version is of an old stock. It's from the original publication in the 50s. This was put out here in these United States by Time Life. And in the recollection recording, which I will do finishing off this whole series, I will talk a little bit about the editorial interference that the I believe Lucis family played in some of the volumes, especially the volumes concerning the 1930s and some of that Twilight War period that Churchill calls it. But that remains for another recording. For today, we're looking indeed at everything from D-Day to Potsdam. Okay, superficially, year and a half, let's say. And wow, he is able to fill out, as he does consistently, about 700 pages of text. That's including the appendices. A real historical author trying to write a monograph has a tremendous, shall we say, embarrassment of riches in this whole series, because each of the 6 volumes has, as I say, these appendices chock full of primary accounts, telegrams, and so forth, letters, and radio addresses. And Churchill, most of this book, in terms of the guts of the book, deals with telegrams back and forth. There's necessarily going to be a certain tediousness to that, but Churchill keeps it moving because he will interject in slightly larger font what's going on in the background of these texts and so forth. So there's this a pace. I found that throughout the whole 6 volumes, there's a great pacing to all the events. I never thought any of the volumes bogged down, certainly not this one. Even when he himself has to really sink his teeth into certain topics, whether these are the conferences, earlier volumes we looked at, like Tehran Conference or the Cairo Conference, the Atlantic Charter Conference. Here we have Yalta, shortly before Roosevelt's death. With Potsdam, indeed. San Francisco makes oblique reference, as Churchill wasn't there. He does reference other of his lieutenants that were sent there. So yeah, a lot of attention is given in this to the conferences and the diplomatic. Of course, that's Churchill's obligation primarily as war minister and as prime minister combined at this hour. A lot of attention is given at the beginning to D-Day, as it concluded the last volume, and also this originally named Project Anvil, Operation Anvil, renamed Dragoon, which was the what was supposed to happen at the same time, which was the landings of allies in the south of France around Marseille. A lot of attention is given to this Operation Dragoon, something Churchill was initially favorable, but as the timeline became more and more discombobulated from D-Day and after the fact, and as Churchill became himself more and more interested in the Balkans in the late war period, he actually became so vocal against this that he really was quite direct as to what a waste of energy this would be and resources. And that if there was to be a landing in southern France, it ought to have been on the west coast of France, not the south from the Mediterranean. In any case, a lot is given over to that and to Churchill's arguments why this was a bad idea. Nevertheless, it went through, as you can see from this. Great attention is paid to Montgomery and his various dealings with Churchill throughout the various volumes. And we'll break this down. The volume I have access to is hardback. It's certainly not the original binding. And the publisher... Here's Houghton Mifflin, originally, as I say, published by Time Life. So this must be a second edition, or there must have been a subsidiary association between Time Life and Houghton Mifflin. So let's just hove into things here. And I will also say, in terms of energy given to obscure things like Operation Dragoon. Also, I was not aware of the communist insurgency in Greece at the end of the wars. The Nazis were kicked out and the British come back into Greece, a Greece they had sacrificed a great deal about, something Churchill repeatedly reminds you, the reader, and the recipients of his telegraphs, that 40,000 British died and were wounded trying to hold off the Germans in their initial invasion of Greece. And so there is, at the time in 1944, as the Germans are withdrawing for various reasons, they're overextended. Churchill says earlier, describing the German overextension, that Hitler had built a spider web. He had made a spider web of the world, but he had forgotten the spider. And all the German forces were committed on the borders of the empire, this new Nazi empire, but there were no internal reserves. Everything was overextended completely. And so eventually there had to be a tremendous contraction, made even more difficult by, as Churchill believes, the rather foolish insistence on the direct interjection of Adolf Hitler to not surrender literally inches of territory. So that at times we saw this even going back to North Africa, around Tunisia, at times when it would have made perfect sense to withdraw, to retreat into more defensible positions. Hitler refuses his commanders this option, and so they will occasionally find themselves, armies and brigades and divisions will find themselves completely on flat ground, following these suicidal orders to hold literally every inch of territory, even though they will take tremendous casualties, and in the long run, this will do them worse than if they had retreated. But that's the reality, and so by 44, certainly the Germans are in sometimes a controlled retreat, and that includes Greece. And at that time, strike while the iron's hot, the Greek Communist Party, the ELAS, conducts an insurgency in Athens, and a lot of attention is paid in this volume to the back and forth there. Very interesting. Churchill talks about this extended period of violence and the scrambling to get British troops there to put that down and to establish the official Greek government. I'll return to that topic of official governments because it really does take up, with various incarnations in different countries, a reoccurring theme, especially in this book, the idea of official governments after the war and unofficial governments and who gets to decide. Before we get there, though, one of the eerie things about the section on the ELAS is that Stalin doesn't say a word. He doesn't lift a finger to help the communists, but he doesn't say a word about this. And you wonder as you're reading, why is that? It's a pretty cruddy communist example of solidarity to just let a robust insurgency become slaughtered. And then you realize by the end of the text, because Stalin was waiting to do the exact same thing to Poland, That is to say, he had, in a sense, given a favor to Churchill in Greece and not come to the assistance of the communists and let the communists be slaughtered by the British and let British power assert itself in whatever would become the new Greek democratic capitalist government. And for that favor of Churchill's, he's expecting by Yalta and certainly by Potsdam, he's expecting the British to step down when it comes to Poland. And that becomes a huge topic closing out the text. And a topic indeed which explains Churchill's second word here, a tragedy. He considers it a tragedy that Britain gets involved on the, at least superficially, defending Poland, if you believe that's the reason Churchill dragged the world into war. And that's still my conclusion. This is one of the most miserable warlords ever. He's a fine author. Churchill's a fine author, and can't say there's nothing endearing to the man, but he has more blood on his hands than almost anyone else, certainly more than the Hitler he provoked into that war. I will also be reviewing in the future Pat Buchanan's book, Churchill, Hitler, and the Unnecessary War. But in any case, what was I talking about there? My animosity towards our dear author overtook me. Yes, the reason Churchill uses tragedy, at least superficially, is Britain got on the side of Poland in 1939, and here it is snatched from out of the orbit of the Allies, or out of the democratic world, as Churchill might spin it. And so there we go. Now, I did allude to a rather interesting diplomatic topic I suppose we don't often think about, and that is official government. So when it comes especially to Italy, Greece, France, and Poland, you have this theme emerge. Who gets to choose which faction is going to be the official legal government? So we're going to go way back in history to something called the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. The Treaty of Westphalia is the beginning of the modern nation-state order. It's the most important event of modern history that you don't know about. This is when priests and cardinals and bishops stop running things and attorneys take over. And this is the beginning of the modern legal nation state. Now, legal and lawful are not in any way, shape, or form the same thing. And in a lawful government, what is necessary is that you assert yourself in a reality. Your clique of government, whether it's a monarchy or whatever form you want, is able to assert its will, and nobody is able to mess with you, and you are the undisputed master of that territory. And the way that people know that you are the master of your lawful territory is because of two things. One of which is that you are able to control the territory you claim. The second of which is that you administer the courts, and people, by hook or by crook, with carrots and with sticks and with threats and with bribes, people avail themselves of your courts and not someone else's. When liberalism arrives, there'll be a third corollary, and that is there will be elections, and people will go to those elections. Those are the things in the lawful pre-modern kingdom that gives you legitimacy. On this earth, as of this recording in 2026, there is, to my knowledge, exactly one group of people that maintain a lawful government on this earth, and that is the Taliban in Afghanistan. And that illusion actually lets me introduce something else that differentiates the legal from the lawful. The Taliban We'll get back to Churchill, don't worry, but this is very appropriate to the 4 countries that he has to deal with. The Taliban is referred to as the Taliban to this day, even though they've been running Afghanistan actually for about 30 years in fits and starts, sometimes throughout a lot of the territory, throughout a little bit of the territory, but there they've been. And undisputedly, they are the lawful masters since August 15th, the Assumption Feast of 20 and 21, nearly 5 years. And yet they are still referred to as the Taliban. They're not referred to as the government of Afghanistan. And that indeed introduces the second point. And it is on this point that Churchill has 4 headaches. And that is, in the Westphalian nation state order, a government is legitimate not only or not even because it can control its territory, administer courts, and administer elections. The fundamental thing in liberalism that makes a regime legitimate and legal, regardless of its lawful reality, is that it is recognized by other legal nation states as being a peer. I'll say that again. In the legal Westphalian system of liberalism, a nation is legitimate and legal because other legal nation states recognize it as such. It's very similar to the Chamber of Commerce in your local town. And it has the exact same psychology of brown nosing and sucking up to the body corporate and schmoozing your way into things. And this will determine whether you are a quote unquote real or legal governing entity. Okay, so getting back to Churchill and the Allies and this sort of thing. When the Italians and the Germans, and indeed, let's not forget, the Russians and the Poles, let's not forget, the Poles were really happy to gobble up parts of Czechoslovakia when they could benefit. Something Churchill, to his credit early on in his memoirs, brings up. The fact that Poland was just as vicious when it benefited them as other nations were towards Poland a little bit later, just a year or two later. In any case, when this whole conflagration we politely call the Second World War began disputing territory and imposing different regimes on lands that had it, whether that's France, again, Italy, Greece, and then Poland, indeed Germany, when this began happening, what necessarily arose in the very, very polarized period of the 1930s, coming out of that into the 40s, is that you have various factions, various political parties that are appealing to various of the allies. And so you have different factions of Free French, different political parties, the same with the Greece. And not only are they Democrats, but they're also communists. Right? And this is what you see in Poland, which indeed takes up a lot of attention towards the end, is the fact that you have 2 governments in exile. The Germans had administered Poland exclusively since June of 1941, when they pushed out the Soviets from half of that territory. There were, especially at this point, although they were around before then, just as one example, this is happening in Italy, Greece, and France and elsewhere. There were other factions as well. But just as an example with Poland, you have what are called the Lwow Poles, the communist Poles that appeal to the Soviet Union to carry on their fight, because these also have armed factions, resistance groups. And then you have the London Poles, who are operating another government in exile. And you have the same phenomena happening in Italy. And with Italy and Greece, you also have the dynamic of pre-existing monarchy, which is a whole other level that pre-exists liberalism and operates on the lawful, not the legal, but has greater rights because of that. It's a different discussion for another day. The point is, Churchill and the Allies and the Soviets, they have to slog through these different claims, obviously being sympathetic given their ideologies to various of these factions and negative towards others of them. And as we saw in Greece, also playing the long game and sometimes letting your own factions get ground under whilst you bide your time in the future. So we have this whole diplomatic aspect, especially towards this last volume. The military attention that Churchill gives in this is, it's persistent throughout. It gives you a good sweep of the war from D-Day, which Churchill wanted to attend, but was dissuaded along with the king by his advisors from doing that, at least initially, although after the fact that would be the case. And indeed, the march through Italy, the different strategies. Churchill, by, we'll say, the second half of 1944, more and more wants to go to Vienna, right? He wants to, once, Normandy's established and that toehold is adamantine and growing, Churchill revisits the Italian campaign and would want nothing more than for the British, the Americans, the Polish contingents fighting in Italy, and others of the Allies. You come to find there were Brazilian brigades fighting for the Allies, which I was completely unaware of. And what Churchill wants to do is basically take as much of how do you say, the Balkans and Southern Europe and Austria for the Allies as possible, not as conquest booty, which would be the case for the Soviets. But Churchill knows that Stalin is going to try to push out the borders as far as possible for the Soviet Union. The Allies, again, to use indeed General Marshall's phrase, enlightened self-interest, the Allies are not looking to impose direct control on the areas they reconquer, but they certainly have every intention of installing client states throughout the Balkans and in all their territories. And so you have that going on throughout. That doesn't come to pass necessarily. And the scramble in the Balkans, Southern Europe, is very chaotic towards the end. Churchill doesn't get into this, but actually this explains why Patton, whom I'm afraid I did not get up here, but why Patton was so pissed off at the end of the war towards the Allied commanders. And there were a lot of U.S. soldiers, and I presume British soldiers, that were captured in the chaos at the end of the war. They were actually captured by their nominal Soviet allies. And Truman and Eisenhower didn't give a flip about that because they were trying to play nice with Stalin. And there were, I seem to recall, 25,000 Americans that were sent down the river to Soviet gulags, and the U.S. government did fuck all about any of them. It's this sort of politicking that's going on, trading indeed, as the Bible says, in the souls of men. Your allies, nonetheless, or your nominal allies. So anyway, Churchill, his idea was to avoid a lot of that and to have just a massive Allied presence pushing up from Greece and then sweeping across Dalmatia once Italy had completely fallen. A little bit of attention is given to Mussolini's career, shall we say, after his imprisonment, and Hitler springs him out of jail. And there's a little republic, I forget the name of it, I think it begins with the letter S, something republic in the north of Italy, which lasts for a little bit, but is eventually ground under. And then a lot of attention, as I'm looking at the table of contents, is also given over to the personal in Churchill, whether that's his Christmas, which is interrupted in 1944 by the events in Greece. Churchill has to literally leave on if not Christmas Eve, then Christmas evening, and go and see to events in Greece. That's how much priority he saw in establishing British power And then also, occasionally, he'll talk about taking vacations and the fact that he's able to take 2 short vacations in 1944 and 45. And for the first time in several volumes, we hear of him reading books for fun and for leisure, more importantly, and then also him painting, which we haven't seen really since volume 1. A lot of people don't realize that Churchill did a lot of painting and indeed a lot of writing. I look forward to reading more of this man's work. I have very little patience for his politics and his warmongering. And as I've said, probably in every one of these reviews, the world would have been a much happier and enlightened place had Churchill just stayed as an author and a painter and kept his nose at least out of international affairs, if not out of politics altogether. But in any case, that wasn't the matter, and he was able to make his will triumph. And you can't grudge a man for that in life, however much you may disagree with him. Finally, in this 700 odd page books, and I did speak in the plural there because each of these 6 physical books is broken up systemically into 2 sections called books. In all of this, Churchill finally gives some attention to the election, which he famously was turned out on his ear after. And he wanted, in order to speak and speak for a unified war government, he wanted to postpone the British elections until after the Japanese were defeated. Knowing by the time of Potsdam that the United States Corporation had finally developed the atomic bomb. And Stalin doesn't quite know that. And he recounts here, which I've heard quoted elsewhere, he recounts the, kind of confused humor that the Soviets received the news of the atomic bomb. They didn't really quite understand what the Americans had developed. And as Churchill said, well, we'll just leave it there. We don't need to give them any ideas about their own research programs and whatever. But in any case, Churchill suspects that the war will be over. In fact, he says this directly, somewhat illusion, in one of his speeches, that we knowing, privately knowing that the United States has the bomb, he says in the House of Commons that, we should postpone the war until Japan is out. And we think this is going to happen actually a lot sooner than we predicted at the beginning. He doesn't say what that changed to bring that to pass, but he alludes to it. In any case, he is unsuccessful in convincing the House of Commons and the King to do that. So if I'm speaking to Americans mostly, elections in England are not regular. In America, every grandstanding politician can synchronize his watch to the various off-year elections and midterms and big year elections. And there's quite a rhythm. In fact, you can almost predict which parties are going to just end up in power in this cycle just because of the dynamics of things. That's not how it works in England. England, the Great Britain, I should say, does not have a single written constitution, which shocks a lot of Americans. It's a compilation of a procedure and various other documents. It's almost like the Catholic Church, in the sense that, or any pre-modern religion, in the sense that it has like these bodies of knowledge, and there's a certain, rule of thumb that everyone knows how to make their case and to operate within it, but it's not a single entity. If you're at all familiar with pre-modern religions, you'll know this is the case. There's no single book that you go to or no single spokesman. It's kind of this larger concept of a tradition. And the English and the British with them, that is to say the Scots, the Irish, and the Welsh, and the Commonwealth, operate under this more amorphous idea of the British Constitution. And so the elections are irregular, and they're kind of set a few weeks out, a few months out, depending on the crises. And you have a certain wiggle room as to when you can do that. And obviously, over the course of the war, now 5 years for England, maybe longer, I guess, for them, there were other parties that had their own interests, whether that's Labour. Churchill, at this point, by the end of the war, was and throughout the war, was a conservative, and that's a political party. That's not just an adjective in Britain. Although I believe Churchill had been Labour earlier, long before the war. So he was not virginal when it came to party swapping, which is, I guess, par for the course for any career politician. In any case, the socialists in Britain, the Labour Party, the different factions, there was a Communist Party in Britain, they had their interest, and they were chomping at the bit to get back to normal and typical party politics. So they wanted to see the dissolution of the war government and a more normal arrangement arise. And so anyhow, the election is set for July, which is after Roosevelt dies, and Truman, very interesting character, kind of a country bumpkin compared to the slick New York scoundrel of FDR. I believe Truman wore 2 watches on his wrist. One had Washington, D.C. time, and the other had Kansas time. So he could always remember his wife back home. I do believe that was also distinctive about Truman, is that his wife did not live in the White House, but stayed back on the farm. I can double check that, but I'm pretty certain that was the case. Howsoever, so yeah, you have a change, first of all, between Roosevelt at Yalta and then Potsdam Conference here with Truman. But also, Churchill at Yalta is leading the war government and is speaking from a position of great power as such. At Potsdam, that coalition is very quickly falling apart in Britain, and Churchill didn't want that in terms of the British interest at Potsdam and afterwards. He wanted the war government to continue, as I said, until at least until the Japanese were defeated, in order to play up the strength of the Western democracies when it came to what Churchill knew was going to have to happen, which was a parting of ways with the Soviets, and also the politicking for the territories. He wanted this unified, strong British government. He didn't get that. He gets voted out. And I think I'll conclude this series of reviews with Churchill's own conclusion that he ends this with, a final speech to the House of Commons, and a nice touch, I think, to bring down the whole set of memoirs. Okay, he gives us on the 26th of July, 1945. The decision of the British people has been recorded in the votes counted today. I have therefore laid down the charge which was placed upon me in darker times. I regret that I have not been permitted to finish the work against Japan. For this, however, all plans and preparations have been made, and the results may come much quicker than we have hitherto been entitled to expect. Immense responsibilities abroad and at home fall upon the new government, and we must all hope that they will be successful in bearing them. It only remains for me to express to the British people, for whom I have acted in these perilous years, my profound gratitude for the unflinching and unswerving support which they have given me during my task, and for the many expressions of kindness which they have shown towards their servant. Finis, as it's written. So there we go. The book number 6 of Churchill, Triumph and Tragedy, rounding out his epic World War II, and that's the title, series. In fact, it's Churchill, as I've said before, that creates that title and popularizes that title for the event, because there were a number of other appellations going around, including the War for Democracy, which was FDR's favorite. The war against the Hitlerite menace for the Soviets, the war against greasy Jewish capitalists, as far as the Germans were concerned. That was their term for the war, by the way. I'm not being funny. So anyway, the Second World War, rather neutral, I suppose. Rather British, therefore, I suppose, is the moniker that we use to this day, largely because of this very series and the popularity of these memoirs. So there we go. I'll put a sock in it here and get to reading the next monographs. I will do eventually a roundup. I'll probably have some more to say about Churchill and just maybe encompass some other war memoirs. But always a very interesting topic for anyone who's nosed a bit deeper into history is that topic of historiography. How are the memoirs after the war written? The events come and gone. Now it's the time to make the official story. Very interesting topic altogether. But I will indeed bring down the bird here. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for reading. Thank you especially for patronizing Apocatastasis, especially by enrolling in our courses. That helps us grow. That money we invest, literally invest for the school on Wall Street and in the different brokerages. And that brings us a financial stability to grow this out as we move towards a campus. So especially thank you for enrolling in our classes. All right. Farewell. God save the King.